So glad to have you here for another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. So, in a previous Todd Talk, I talked about executive functioning skills. In a nutshell, executive functioning skills are the building blocks that you need in order to be successful. So, these are the things that successful people typically do. Now, there's lots of different things that people do to be successful, but the ones I'm going to be talking about are the common ones that almost all successful people do. And so we have to be very deliberate about teaching our students how to do these things. So we can't assume that these are learned skills. These are not born skills. These are learned, and we can't assume that they've learned it somewhere along the way. Even when you have seniors in high school, they may not have some of these executive functioning skills. And with some of our gifted students, they may not possess these executive functioning skills because they've never needed to have them before. They were always able to get by on their intelligence alone. But as we know, that will eventually catch up with them, and they'll need to have these skills in place in order to be successful. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the executive functioning skill of planning. And what does planning look like when you're teaching that to students? So planning, as you know, is having an idea of what you want to do before you start the work. So for example, let's say that you're going to start building a house. You don't just start randomly throwing things together. You would have a plan. Sometimes that would be a blueprint. You might have other directions. You may have other people with certain jobs, but there is a clear plan before the work starts. And the reason why is so that your house looks like a house when everything is said and done. If you don't have a clear plan in place and what you're going to have to achieve to get to that plan, then you're not going to get the results that you want. Now that's a fairly simple one because you can actually see your results. Sometimes we can't always see the results. But in the classroom, what this might look like when you're planning is an essay. So if you've asked students to write a 5-paragraph essay, and the first thing students usually want to do is start writing. There's no planning going on. And as a result, the essay that they turn in is not of high quality. The essays that are much better usually start with planning first. And so what they do is they say, okay, this is how I'm going to plan my paragraph. I'm going to do an outline. I'm going to bring in evidence from different places and see where that might go. And I'm not going to start writing my actual essay until I have that blueprint, just like the house, a blueprint in place. So this is what planning in the classroom would look like. One strategy you might want to try with your students when it comes to planning is to try to teach them what's called the backwards design process or backwards building. And just like its name implies, you are working backwards. So what you do first is you identify your end goal. So what do you want to have accomplished? What does that look like when you achieve what it is that you wanted to achieve? So let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're going to run a marathon, which is over 26 miles. So if you're starting with doing the backwards building process, your end goal, my end goal, was always to cross the finish line without dying. So that is your goal, is to cross that finish line. So when all is said and done, when all the celebration is over, when everything takes place, all that matters is that you cross that finish line. So that's your end goal, is to do that. So the question then becomes, then how do you determine mastery of said goal? And so you might say, well, of course, crossing the finish line is what shows mastery, but there might be other parameters that you have. For example, mastery may be trying to cross the finish line without having stopped anywhere along the way. Or it might be trying to hit a certain time. I'm going to complete my marathon in 4.5 hours. So you determine that mastery sometimes when you're planning. Sometimes the teacher establishes what mastery looks like. And it may come in the form of a rubric or something in that nature. So you're going to establish, okay, what does mastery look like? And then you have to figure out, okay, how do I achieve that? So then you start looking at the planning phase, or what is your plan? How are you going to get from the beginning to this end goal? Okay, you start here though with the end goal. So let's take our marathon example. So I've crossed the finish line. Great. What do I have to do before I cross the finish line? Well, I have to meet the halfway mark, 13.1 miles. And then what do I have to do before that? I have to be at the start and start when I'm supposed to start my race. And then you can take it back even further, because if you told me to run a marathon today and you asked me to go out and run 26.2 miles, it's not going to happen, because I'm not ready for that. I haven't planned for that. I haven't trained for that. My body's not ready for that physically. So I have to consider other parts of my plan too. How far back in my plan do I need to go? So talking about my first, when I'm working backwards, was the race itself, but there are things that have to happen before then. So for example, I have to make sure that I have the proper clothing and the proper footwear when I get to the race. I have to make sure I have my music, because I can't run without music. So I've got to make sure I have those things. And then you can take it back even further. So when I go to run my 26 miles, the training I've done the week before, have I rested properly? Have I eaten properly before I show up to actually run the race? Then I say, okay, 2 weeks before the race, I'm going to run 20 miles. So I'm going to set myself up to prepare myself for that. And then a month before that, I may say, I'm going to run 10 miles, and so on and so forth, until I get to the very beginning of my plan, where I go out and run for a mile. That's where I start. So I've broken this up into chunks, manageable chunks that I can see how to accomplish. If you just said, go run a marathon, I'd be like, no way. But because I can break it up into chunks and plan what that would look like, it makes a lot more sense. So again, we're starting with this end in mind and working our way backwards as we go along. The reason why we do this is because if you start with this end in mind, so here's my end point, and I work backwards like this, I can say right before this part, this is what I need to do. Right before this part, this is what I need to do, and so on and so forth. So let's say your end result is getting a good grade on a test. Well, there's a lot that goes into that. First off, as your end goal is, I want to get an A, or maybe it's just I want to finish the test, or I want to get a good grade, whatever you determine that is. You define mastery. So what does mastery of that mean? So your teacher, again, is going to establish, the teacher themselves are going to establish that mastery through what their expectations are, but you might have masteries of your own. You may say, okay, I'm really shooting for this. I really want to make sure I write at least 2 paragraphs in my answers, or I want to do. You may have your own mastery in your mind what you want to do, and then you plan. So we have the test here, but before we get to that point, we have to come to the test prepared with our writing utensils and whatever we might need to take that test. We have to do a before night cram session where we try to get every last thing in before we actually have to take the test. Some people just call this studying in general. That's all they do. But if you're planning accordingly, if you want to have a greater chance of success to reach your goal, then 3 days before that, you might review your notes. 3 days before that, you might want to take notes from what you've been reading and study those notes for comprehension to make sure you have them. And then at the very beginning, it's getting the assignment in the first place. Okay, we're going to have a test over this, and this is what this is going to encompass. And that's your beginning part. But working backwards, you can figure out, how do I plan my progress? If you don't start at the end, then a lot of times what the progress will look like is like this. And then you get to your end, but it's not the end result that you want. And you've wasted a lot of time. You've gone backwards at times. You've gone up, you've gone down. So this is just a more streamlined, efficient way of accomplishing what you want to accomplish by using a plan. And this is the backwards building design process that students can think of in order to create that plan for themselves. So this idea of planning is all very well and good. But the question becomes, as a teacher, what tools can you try to provide students in order to be able to plan? So what things can you provide for them? You can't do it for them. You need for them to be able to do this themselves, but you can certainly help them along the way with certain tools. So I'm going to talk about two different things that you might want to use to help with planning. One of these is a to-do list, and the other one is a calendar. So I'm going to talk about both of these, and then how you might even combine the two when it comes to planning. So what I'm showing you right here is a simple monthly calendar. And so if you've got a long-term project, you could plot this out every single day, what it's going to look like for the month. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're working on a project that your teachers assign, asking you to create a website. So you would start at the end of this calendar. You would put website complete at the end where the due date is, and then you'd work backwards from there. So what do I need to accomplish in order to get to that website? Well, I have to code it. Before you can code it, I have to have things to put in there. So I have to pull in research and different things of that nature. I have to make sure I know how to code in the first place. I need to then find out, like, a plan. What is my idea of what my website's going to look like? What do I want it to visually look like? Do I have a plan in place? And I keep working backwards to the point where you've been assigned the project at the beginning of the month. So in each of these boxes, students can simply write, what do they hope to accomplish that day? They start at that end, and then they work their way backwards so that they can see how to get there. So a monthly calendar is great for long-term projects when students are looking at multiple weeks. And the limitation, of course, is that you can only put usually one or two things in those smaller boxes. So what you might want to consider is using a weekly planner, which looks something like this, where it breaks it down into the days of the week. And then you can list several things that you hope to accomplish on that day. So it may not be this, the calendar may have been pertaining to one project in particular, but the weekly planner may be all of your work. So what am I going to accomplish this day? And make a list of things that you're going to accomplish. So this just allows the plan to be a little more detailed, to focus in a little bit more by looking at it at a weekly. And then you take this exact same 4-week project that students were assigned and break it down by week and what needs to happen. You could take it even further and narrow the focus down to a daily calendar like you see right here. You can see the daily calendar allows you to break it down even further into time slots. So from this time to this time, I'm going to do this. From this time to this time, I'm going to do this, and so on and so forth. And so a student can plan out their entire day. I'm going to go to social studies first, and this is what I'm going to accomplish in social studies. Then I'm going to math, and this is what I'm going to, and they can do that by the times. And so by focusing in, by getting further and further focused, this just allows them to have more details for how to accomplish their plan. Because if they say, take notes, and that's all they say, they may not know how to accomplish that. What research do they need to do? How do they take the notes? Things like that. So they might want to have the ability to break it down even further. But having these blank calendars, whether it's weekly, monthly, or daily, will allow students to then kind of put it out on a piece of paper and plan for what that's going to look like. So that's going to be really important. I like to use project calendars with my students all the time because we were doing long-term projects, and sometimes it was hard to see that end goal or to see the finish line. So when you start a marathon, you can't see the finish line. So it's hard to envision it. But if you can get an aerial view beforehand, before you show up to the race, and you can see where that finish line is going to be, you have a better idea of how manageable that's going to be. So having blank calendars is one way to help students with planning. And of course, you'd want to show them what this looks like. You might want to use your own example. So for example, I use my Google Calendar to do a lot of my daily planning. So if you look at my Google Calendar, what you see is I will have the day all planned out for what is that going to look like. And so I have it broken down by hour, whether I have meetings, whether I have a conversation with someone, or whether I'm doing some work. But I'll break that down, and that helps me to organize my day so that I'm very efficient with my day. The second tool that you might want to consider besides calendars are to-do lists. And to-do lists are a little less a little less organized, so to speak, than a calendar, but they allow you to get more detailed. So when you're doing a to-do list, you can have a blank one such as you see here, and you just list all the things that you need to do. I love to-do lists personally. If you give me a list of things to do and you put, I want to accomplish all the goals on that list. So I'll go through one by one and do that. Some people aren't like that, but it still helps to have the list to guide what you're going to do. So you can use just a really basic one like that to list all the things that you have to do. You can also use one such as what you see here to actually break down, okay, here's my subject area. So I'm going to do my English here, my economics here, and so on and so forth. So this to-do list just breaks it down even further. Okay, so that you're seeing the separation of the different tasks. And in this case, it's chronological when it comes to time. So I'm going to do this task first because that's what the time for it, and so on and so forth. You could even have to-do lists for various aspects of your life. So you can see this one here has a to-do list for work, and it has a different one for home, because those are two very different things. The calendar that I showed you before is my work calendar. I also have a personal calendar that I use, which looks like this. And on this, I have things that are going to do with my family, like my daughter has tennis practice. My wife is off of work. If we have any other family activities, we'll put them on this. But this is a way that I keep myself organized, by separating my work from my home. And so similarly, a student might want to separate their school work from what they need to accomplish at home. So their chores or whatever it is that they're being asked to do. So sometimes schools provide planners for students to do this, but sometimes they don't. So you'd want to provide a way for them to capture what it is that they're going to do. Now you can take the calendar and the to-do list and kind of combine them in what you see here. In here you have a weekly planner where they list out day by day what they're going to do, but it also gives them a to-do list so they can list out the things that they're going to accomplish. And then there's notes if they need to put a phone number or a website or something that's going to help them accomplish what they need to accomplish, they can put those notes. So this is just another example of a planner, a graphic organizer that's going to help them to plan. When they're planning their to-do list, however, one thing to consider is that they have to be able to prioritize. So what I mean by this is if you go to eat a meal, you don't start with your dessert, even though it's the most interesting and best tasting thing to do. Why? Because that is typically the end of the meal. You have to eat your appetizers first and get your main course where you get your proteins and whatever, and only then do you get to your dessert. So you want to prioritize, and you want to make sure that you're going in a proper order. And so lots of times with tasks, there is a specific order to go in. Other times you have to prioritize these. So I have A, B, C, D, and E to do, but which one is the most important thing? So if you have multiple subject areas that you're looking at, a student might say, I need to do my math work first because that is due tomorrow, so that I need to prioritize that. My social studies project is not due for another week or so, so that's going to be less of a priority. So you can break them down into, like you see here, must-dos. What do you really need to accomplish? Must be done. What should you do? Something that you should do, but it doesn't absolutely have to be done today. You could do it tomorrow. And then lastly is what you aspire to do. And so this is more long-term. What do you hope to get done? And so you need to make sure that students also know how to prioritize. And so what I would do with my daughter when she was planning when COVID, she would get assignments and she would make a to-do list on her planner. And then I'd have her go through and I'd have her number. What is the most important thing? Not that you want to do, but that you have to do. Because what I found was that she was prioritizing based on her own interest rather than what she needed, what was called for. And so she would go through and she would number them. And then she would go and she would accomplish them once. She would start with one and do one. And if she got to the end, then she would do her final one and she had everything accomplished. Sometimes she didn't get to those final ones, but it was okay because they were aspire to do's. So they weren't necessarily required, but she made sure she got the important things done first. So this is a real struggle with some students and some adults where they want to do what's most pleasing or the shiniest thing first rather than what they really need to do or have to do. So that's another skill that you want to be teaching students is how do you prioritize? what needs to be done? How do you figure out what are the important things? You can also, Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the United States, he had this famous quadrant to determine. So this is a strategy you might want to use with students, where you have these important and urgent on the X and Y axis. And so what you have here is quadrant one is it is really important and it's urgent. So you need to get that done now. So that is definitely a priority. You might run into some which are urgent, but maybe not as important. So you still want to get those done in a timely manner, but not as when it comes to the things that are really important. Okay, so this allows you to then kind of figure out a way to figure out, okay, this one is more important than this one, and then you have your not urgent column. Something that's important but not urgent could be third thing that you do, and then something that's not urgent or not important, you might just want to eliminate altogether. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you want to watch a Netflix show. You have that on your list of things to do, but it's not urgent nor important. You might just want to get rid of that if you don't have the time. Now, if you have the time and you've earned that, then you should certainly do that. But you should not do that first, okay? Because you have more urgent, more important things to do. So this is a strategy that you might want to use with students to help them determine what is urgent and important as opposed to what is not urgent and not important. What you see here is a to-do list that prioritizes. So you have your top priorities, you list those in the goal date that you have, your secondary tasks that you have. So these are not as important, and then notes down below. And so what this allows a student to do is to figure out, okay, this is what I need to really be working on at this point. And so with your guidance, that will help them to do that. So the calendar and to-do list are two very good tools that you can use with students to help them plan. But you may need to show them how to use these. You can't just give them a blank calendar and say, go at it. So when I'm starting projects with students, when we're first starting project-based learning, I provide the calendar for them. And I say, this is what you should have done by this day, so on and so forth. And then as we get further along in the year, I just give them a blank calendar and I say, now you plan it out. I want you to figure out how to do it. Same thing with student planners. We often will check their planners to make sure they have stuff in there, but are they prioritizing? And if they don't know how to do that, have you shown them how to prioritize? And you can use numbers, you can use colors, you can use all sorts of things to prioritize. But you have to teach students strategies for how to prioritize, how to determine what's the most important thing to do when it comes to your planning. So a couple of things to consider when it comes to teaching students planning. So one of these is that you want to get them in the mindset of this planning. And so Stephen Covey has what he calls the 7 habits of highly effective people. And one of those habits is begin with the end in mind. So this may take some doing to change a student's mindset to begin with the end in mind or to backwards build, because we typically want to start at the beginning. So we don't read a book from the back to the front. We're taught to go from the beginning to the end. However, when it comes to planning, so the author that wrote that book and had to plan out that book, they probably did start with the ending. They probably did work backwards from there. Most authors have their ending in place before they even start writing, so they know where to write toward. So similar with your students, you need to get them in that mindset. If they're planning, they need to start with the end in mind and then work it backwards. And then once it's planned, then they start at the beginning and work their way through. So that's one thing to consider, is that you have to be able to change their mindset when it comes to that. The second thing is that you yourself need to be an example of what good planning looks like. So you're a teacher. Your job is to plan. We do what's called lesson plans. So the question becomes, are you an efficient planner? Are you an effective planner? Are you someone where the plan is really clear to students because you list it on the board? Or you break it down where you prioritize things? Make these things transparent with students. Show them, yeah, these are all the things you need to do, but I'm prioritizing it like this, okay? And that way they can see this in action for themselves, what this looks like, because you are doing this every single day as a teacher, but your students may not be aware of it. So be open to making them aware of that so they can see how this works in the real world. Because ultimately, being able to plan is not just going to help them in school. It's not just going to be able to help them in college. It's going to be able to help them the rest of their lives, no matter what they choose to do. Planning is a really valuable skill that they would want to learn.